Toxic masculinity is a phrase that's been used an awful lot for a long, long time, and certainly even more so in recent weeks and months with the TV show Adolescence and the issues related to young men's engagement with the world around them and their engagement in educational spaces. I'd say being brought to the front of the public consciousness in a way that it hasn't necessarily been done before. Aligned with that commentary, we have seen the phrase toxic masculinity being used by everybody from newspaper reporters to government politicians to expert commentators on the issues who are all driving towards the dialogue where they're looking for a solution. We've seen Keir Starmer and Number 10 working with the show's directors to get adolescence shown in high schools around the country as an educational resource. Whilst on the surface that is absolutely brilliant, you know, as somebody that has written a book about all of this and that cares about this, it's something that is really important to me that we start to have these conversations. It's also highlighted the importance of these conversations being careful and the need for them to be careful. We need to start from the right place, and we need to have a shared language to have that discussion, which means everybody's coming at it from the same angle. Now, if we take toxic masculinity as a phrase, that's one of the key elements where through its use we can set ourselves up to have completely the wrong conversation to start with, and one that actually could lead to being quite helpful. And I'm going to give kind of three different points around toxic masculinity that I think it exemplify where that challenge comes in. Firstly, if we look at the phrase toxic masculinity, it sets up a binary. You are either masculine or you are toxically masculine, and those are your two options. And actually, when it comes to what it means to be masculine, to be a man, and to convey and enact masculinity, it's far more diverse. You know, I work with young people in schools, and the young men that I work with, I have some that love computer games, some that love art, some that love being outdoors and doing sport, some that are like completely the opposite and are quite studious, some that are quite shy and reserved, others that are really loud and really bolshy. And all of these things are different forms of masculinity. If you looked at the career that you were going to go to as a young man, you would probably say that you would enact your masculinity differently if you were looking towards a career as an engineer or a football coach, as opposed to a career as a teacher or a nurse, a mental health nurse, for an example. So this idea that there is one masculinity and it is either toxic or not toxic really limits the conversation we can have when it is clearly evident that there are so many ways to be a young man, so many ways to be a man, and so many forms of masculinity that are perfectly acceptable and legitimate. The issue that we find comes in with that is when we are creating these binaries, we are narrowing our field of vision, and we are putting young men potentially into boxes depending on one view, which society deemed problematic, or another view that doesn't account for these huge array of differences and the humanity of men, you know, when they engage in kind of practices aligned with their masculinity. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, if we look at toxic masculinity and we look at the kind of academic underpinnings of the term and where it actually came from, it kind of came into mainstream profile and usage in the early 2000s with academics that were looking at hypermasculine behavior in prisons. And the phrase toxic masculinity was termed as a way of defining some of that masculine behavior that they were observing in the prison setting. So taking that term out of a prison setting and that specific social context which those academics were analysing, and then applying it to all men, you know, and all forms of masculinity across society, really raises the question as to whether it's an appropriate term to be using to capture that experience and those plurality of kind of masculinities that we spoke about in that first point. And the third point, and the final point, And the one that is most important, I think, if we are looking at making a change for young men in education towards futures and futures masculinities, which are hopeful, which are compassionate, which are empathetic, is if you are using the term toxic masculinity, what you're doing is implicitly stating that there is something inherently toxic with being a young man. And if we see that with educators and lesson resources, say that are coming off the back of adolescence, then actually a lot of the framing around the work is you are a problem as a young man inherently, and what we need to do is deproblematize who you are fundamentally as a human being, because you're at risk of engaging in toxic masculine behavior, of being a perpetrator of misogyny. So no recognition of these wonderful strengths, these different forms of masculinity that can be taken. Instead, it's locked in this conversation which starts at this point of deficit. There is nothing inherently wrong with being a young man. Where the problem comes in is in a patriarchal societal structure that we have messaging from actors such as people, social media content producers in the manosphere, who are stating that particular forms of masculinity, those that are linked to kind of traditional values, ones that might have that implicit sexism and misogyny, are the most legitimate ways to be a man. And actually what we're looking at is a contest, not for whether it's toxic masculinity or not toxic masculinity, but on the form of masculinity which is deemed to be most legitimate. And these actors will be pushing a really harmful form of masculinity as the most legitimate in a context where there are a plurality of masculinities and so many different ways to be a man that can lead to happy, healthy manhoods, great relationships with loved ones, being a fantastic dad, romantic partner, having a fulfilled career, having a good circle of mates that you can talk to if you're going through challenges. And our role isn't to tackle toxic masculinity. Instead, it's to provide a hopeful alternative to those horrendous influencer messages that are making their way to young men through social media platforms, and talking about strength as something that is linked to care, empathy, compassion, emotional intelligence as strongly as physical strength of being able to lift up something that's really, really heavy. And until we move past this binary toxic masculinity conversation, then I feel we're going to be stuck exactly where we are. The book that I've got coming out in July, Lost Boys, provides far more detail and an in-depth explanation as to how and why we can begin to change this conversation and to move forwards towards a more hopeful future.